Welcome back. The recent attack on the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo has left many wondering, what do Muslims say about this? What are the root causes of this sort of violence? How do we prevent such violence in the future? Joining me is Dr. Shabir Ally to discuss this topic further. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
My pleasure to be on.
So what's your initial message to our viewers regarding these incidents that occurred in Paris?
First of all, we should speak very clearly and without equivocation in saying that this is terrible, it's wrong, it's against the teachings of Islam. We cannot kill people for their right to disbelief and to express their disbelief. As much as we may feel hurt by some of their expressions of disbelief, some of their mockery and satirizing of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the things that we hold dear and we hold sacred, we have to maintain patience, and we cannot attack people physically for their verbal attacks against us.
So the conversations that we've been hearing now is, twofold. One is obviously that this was horrible and, it shouldn't happen. But then the other conversation that's coming to rise now is this notion of freedom of expression. So what does the Quran say about that, especially given that Charlie Hebdo, was it released cartoon images of depicting the Prophet Muhammad?
Well, what we know more generally is also a feature of the Quran, in that in civil society there has to be a balance between, on the one hand, allowing for the freedom of expression, and on the other hand, not misusing that freedom of expression to harm other people. So in terms of the freedom that the Quran speaks about, there's a general freedom for people to disbelieve. For example, in the 17th chapter it says, فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wants, let him or her believe or disbelieve according to their wishes. And naturally, as one's belief would be expressed in a certain way, one's disbelief would be expressed in a certain way as well. One's belief, for example, would be expressed in terms of, let's say, praising God, perhaps even in public. But at the same time, one's disbelief may result in one's condemning God or condemning belief in God, even in public. So this is a natural part of society. So that general freedom is allowed. More than this, the Quran shows that in fact people have throughout history been condemning and criticizing and ridiculing the prophets of God, messengers from God. The most extreme case of this is the case of Jesus, where we see that an attempt was made to crucify him. The Quran speaks about all of this kind of attack on the prophets and messengers of God, but the Quran never says that believers should take it on their own to bring these persons to some kind of justice by exacting some physical punishment or penalty for them in this life. To be more clear, the Quran prescribes certain punishments for certain crimes. So there's a penal code, as most societies would have some penal codes in response to certain crimes. And the crimes are specified in the Quran for which there is a specific punishment. But for blasphemy or ridiculing or satirizing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or any of the prophets of God for that matter, there is no such prescription in the Quran. What the Quran promises again and again is that God will deal with these people. God may send them a dreadful punishment in this life, or he may take them to task in the life hereafter. So it's not for Muslims really to say, okay, let me bring these people to justice by either killing them or harming them in some way in this life. This is not for us to do. This is between them and God, because when they do this with God's messengers, they are actually committing an affront to God himself.
So if it's not in the Quran, then what are I guess from what you know, what do you think are the root causes of why this kind of thing is happening?
Well, there are several causes that have been prescribed or that have been diagnosed in discussions falling out of this, because of course there are three stages here. First, there is the condemnation. Second is the analysis of what are the causes, and then third will be the prescription as to how do we prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. So now in the analysis phase, people are looking at why do Muslim youth in particular, but people more generally, turn to acts of violence. One issue in the case of the French young Muslims in particular is that, as we know from history, France had colonized a large part of North Africa, including Algeria. And after France moved out of the North African continent, out of the North African region of the African continent, there followed a migration of French-speaking people from that part of the world into France. But following their migration, while they were legally welcomed in France, they were not socially so welcomed. At least this is how they felt. And now we have a new generation of people, young Muslims who were born in France, they're raised there, they're now in their teenage years and a little bit older, and they're struggling to assert their own identity. Are they French? Are they Muslims? What exactly are they? They want to be French because that's what they are, that's all they have known, but they're being repeatedly told that they don't belong here, they should go back home and so on. In addition to all of this, what is being pointed out is that many of these young people are unemployed and they do not see a bright future for themselves. They see that doors are being closed in their faces. So with all of this, the ghettoization, the poverty, unemployment, lack of identity, a feeling of humiliation, now this requires a sort of answer, and the answer that comes from them is not the right one, but we can see that this answer sort of coming. They want to assert their identity even by committing acts of violence in defending what they think to be the identity that they should uphold, their Muslim identity.
So then how can we, I mean, obviously it's a multifaceted issue and there isn't one answer, but how can we, prevent these kinds of incidences from happening? Because, I mean, they seem to happen too often, unfortunately.
Yes, and recently a lot of such incidents have occurred. And one solution is to turn the Muslim youth back to reading the Quran. Because if we study the Quran very carefully, we will see that their response is the wrong one. While they think that we're supporting Islam and following Islam and being its defenders, they're actually going against the dictates of the Quran. Because repeatedly the Quran says to people, to Muslims in general, to the Prophet, peace be upon him in particular, to leave alone the people who are mocking and satirizing and even physically harming him. For example, the Quran in one chapter, early revealed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, says, وَهْجُرْهُمْ هَجْرًا جَمِيلًا, leave them alone in a nice way, which means that sometimes if there is a kind of altercation and we're being broken up, like let's say two boys are fighting in a schoolyard, then as they're being broken up, one of them tries to deliver the last punch to the other guy, so he gets the satisfaction that he gave the last hit. But the Quran is saying, leave them alone in a beautiful way. So we are to part in peace. The Quran describes the believers as those who, when they're being mocked at or jeered or scoffed at, they say salama, they say peace. And so that is their parting word. They leave that situation of violence. And we should, in fact, rather than feel angry, because this is natural, we feel hurt that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is being mocked or depicted in a way that is far below his dignity as a prophet and messenger of God. So we feel that hurt, and sometimes that gives rise to anger, but rather we should evoke pity for such people. And this is shown in the Quran in the 36th chapter, in the 30th verse. God says, Ya hasratan ala al-ibad ma ya'tihim min rasulin illa kanu bihi yastahzi'un. Oh, pity the servants, meaning the creatures of God here, those who are mocking the prophets and messengers, because no prophet comes to them except that they mock the prophet, the messenger of God. So God has pity for these people. What's the problem here? We might be thinking, let's defend our prophet. We feel sorry for our prophet. But rather we should be thinking, let's feel sorry for these people who are mocking the messengers, because what do they do by mocking the messengers? They create a situation which they will face in the life hereafter, a situation where they will be deprived of the mercy of God. They will be under the punishment of God. That's not what we want for people, and we pity them that they, in their ignorance, are putting themselves in that situation for God to punish them. Oh, pity the servants who are mocking the messengers.
What do you say, and I've had this conversation with my own friends as well, where, we're just fed up and frustrated. So what advice do you have to, I mean, reading about this all the time, having to speak about it and say, no, we don't believe in this, like what's the response, like how should we deal with that as, I guess, young people living in this day and age?
An important part of my prescription for how do we prevent such problems in the future and how do we help people to channel their energies in a positive way is that we need to be active in delivering the message about Islam and about our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now historians are studying the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, like never before, and they're realizing that he was a man who was a very capable leader in his time. He was outstanding. The book, The 100, the ranking of the most influential persons in history by Michael Hart, has placed the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as #1 of the 100. Karen Armstrong has written a book on the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and she subtitled that book, A Prophet for Our Time. And she explains in that book that a man like the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, could be an important spiritual guide and world leader even in our present circumstances. When non-Muslims are appreciating our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, like this, because they come to have a direct understanding of his life and mission, we have all of the more reasons as Muslims for taking this message far and wide and letting people know who the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was. Our fear usually is that if he's depicted in a wrong light, either in text or in print or in visual media, in cartoons and so on, that people are going to have the wrong impression about him, and that makes us feel uneasy. Well, the best way to give the right impression about the Prophet, peace be upon him, is to actively preach about him. And young Muslims will be well advised to live a life which demonstrates the characteristics and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in their own lives, so that people will be impressed to know that here we have young people who are following the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that leads them to live a wholesome life, one that is reflecting of honesty, of dignity, of purity, and of service to humankind, and at the same time to be prepared to explain something about the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, to non-Muslims, so that they too will appreciate something about the Prophet.
This was very helpful. Thank you very much, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.